Hey guys, Dan Bradbury here, and I'm excited to have another special guest on the Dan Bradbury podcast. In a moment, I'll be introducing Mr. Alexis Kingsbury. So Alexis is the co-founder of two software companies, Air Manual and Spider Gap, and really they help businesses in a variety of different ways. But it's about processes, systems, streamlining. How do you be more efficient, especially on the Air Manual side? And Alexis has been part of our community. We started working together, well, let's just say over a decade ago, and just let's just leave it at that. And in this episode, I'm going to be picking Alexis's brains about how to stop being the bottleneck in your business. Really common kind of scaling issues, and a big problem we all have. Most entrepreneurs are control freaks, or, well, I'll just say I'm a bit of a control freak, apparently, if you ask my wife and children. And how do we get beyond that? How do we delegate? And how do we scale up and get leverage when, instead of just turning around and blaming our employees constantly? So with all that said, Alexis, welcome to the show.
Fantastic. Great to be here. Thank you very much, Dan.
So probably a start for 10. I mean, I do think that there's so many routes we could go down. You've got legendary status in our community because you've helped so many business owners from our community as well as wider systemize and remove themselves from the business. But let's just have the foundation in place first, because I think it's a bit of a useful context. You've built multiple successful companies, but let's just talk about the software ones. Could you give us a brief overview? What does Air Manual do? What does Spider Gap do?
Yeah, so I want to start by saying at first, I was terrible at building companies that didn't rely on me when I first started. Back when I started my first, if you can call it a business, when I was about 11 or 12 years old. I always knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur and a business owner. And I remember thinking that I wanted to be bigger than Branson back then. That's the entrepreneur with airplanes, not the pickle. And I wanted to sort of build these incredible businesses. And yet, even back then, and actually, even while at university, and I kind of started businesses then, whenever things started to go well, I'd get busy and then completely cap out. So I wasn't able to then continue to sell and to grow the business because I was doing all the doing. And over, I kept on realizing, or concluding is probably more accurate, that the problem was the business model. It's that I'd chosen a type of business that depended on me. So whether it was like a particular business that I was doing was like washing cars when I was really young. And so I was like, well, the problem is that I've chosen this non-scalable business model. And so I remember at university when I was selling headsets, so I was buying these headsets in bulk and then like selling them on eBay. But I was doing all the post and packaging of all this sort of stuff, but there wasn't enough profit margin in it to hire. So I was concluding, the problem is the business model. And so over and over, I would start new businesses because I felt like, the business is wrong. And whilst there's some truth in that, the biggest truth that I then found when I then went into management consulting and then started my first software business was actually just that, as you said in your intro, I'm a bit of a control freak, and I was really struggling to let go and hand over things successfully. Now, through being part of the mastermind, through with you and working with other entrepreneurs, I was kind of encouraged, like, you just need to let go, and as a result, you'll be able to build these successful businesses. And the problem was that I would try, and then it would go wrong. And as a result, I would end up feeling back at square one because now I've tried to delegate, spent a load of money on someone, because typically it's not like within a few minutes you go, no, this isn't working, get rid of them. It was typically weeks or normally months before I realized I'm losing money on this and can't see a way through. And so would end up back at square one. And that repeated for me for many, many years, many, many businesses. But it was in my first software business that I finally cracked it, which was Spider Gap. And Spider Gap was all about developing employees in an organization. So it was particularly built around the concept of 360-degree feedback, where you essentially use online surveys to collect feedback from a person's manager, their peers, any direct reports they've got, and a self-assessment to help them plan their personal development. And so we're really passionate about supporting employees in organizations to continuously improve themselves and as a result perform better. The problem was that as I experienced with clients, but particularly in my own business, actually, if they don't perform well, there's only so much coaching and support you can provide before you end up just going, oh, but they're just not doing it the way that it needs to be done. And particularly the more complex the process or more important the detail was, I'd get very frustrated and so on. So I got stuck in that loop, but eventually managed to overcome that, particularly by documenting our processes, documenting step-by-step onboarding, and making it easy for our team to be able to take over those tasks, even very complex ones, off my plate, and was able to then repeat that over and over and able to extract myself completely from the day-to-day and be able to go on 6-week holidays in a motorhome with my family, and not need to open my laptop and to work. And that was what led to then saying, well, actually, how do we help others to do this? Because entrepreneurs, other people on the mastermind group, etc., with you would say, well, how have you done this, Alexis? And when I start to show them, and here's our processes and this is how it works, I was showing them a patchwork of tools and stuff that I'd put together, which just doesn't work for most people because, particularly if they're not in a software business, their comfort's less. And so it was that led us to go, well, actually, how do we remove all the friction from this, both in terms of getting the process documented, getting it followed by the team, getting it continuously improved. And so that's why we then created Air Manual, which is then this, process documentation in the cloud, in the air, that all the team can then use. So that was kind of the journey that we went on. And they've now been helping, over 100 organizations to free up their time and reduce the stress in their businesses as a result.
Yeah, so well, let me speak to that, and let me also dive straight in with some of the biggest objections. I think that Alexis, I'll say this. You wouldn't say this about yourself because you're too humble, but you don't have to talk to Alexis too long to realize that he's very intelligent. But I'll also a reference that I didn't ask you permission for, Alexis, but that ask forgiveness and permission is very conservative, manages his finances very well. So some of you listening to this can resonate kind of with that, but that kind of becomes a trap more so on the intellectual side than on the financial side, in the sense of we become control freaks because we're good at doing all the various pieces. And one of the things that bugs me, Alexis, is when people get onto the systems and, they read the E-Myth, which is a great book, but they get obsessed with it and they all use the McDonald's as the example. But then I find most of the people listening to this have businesses that are more complicated than a McDonald's. And therefore they either don't do it, there's a complete absence of documentation, and they just hire somebody, go, it doesn't bloody work, and it becomes self-reinforcing, and they do it again and again. But I sometimes find people go the other way, and they document the crap out of everything, only to find that it seemingly doesn't, it still doesn't work. So I suppose my question for you is, where do you start? So somebody listening to this, chances are they're a 7-figure business owner. They have a small team. There's more stuff on their plate still that they want. And you could argue that, well, if you're the CEO, if you're running the organization, problems will bubble up that can't be dealt with lower down the org chart. So you're always going to have the shittiest problems. But how do you differentiate between, no, this is a problem that should be allowed to bubble up, and you don't need to document for when there's the once in 100-year episodes in your business, versus no, you're just caught up with a plethora of 30 hours a week worth of bullshit that could easily be documented and outsourced. Where do you start? How do you begin to differentiate between what bucket it falls in? If that makes
great question, because I agree with how you're painting that as that spectrum, and I've seen that with clients where you've got the ones that have got absolutely nothing documented, and as a result will self-describe it as a shit show, and their staff will go, yeah, everything's chaotic and whatever and very stressful. And then you've got the other end of the spectrum where often it'll be a business owner or some person in the organization who's very detail orientated and everything's documented but almost to a point that actually the team are almost scared of it. They don't want to touch it. They don't think that they can edit it because it's like it's kind of their baby. And it's like, well, that's you've just changed what the business was dependent on you for. And so I've definitely seen that. The way that we like to apply it, and we've ended up with this kind of this 4-stage process, is we say stage 1 is what's the focus. And so despite the fact that people often come to my team at Air Manual and say, okay, I've finally realized I need to document my business. And we say, well, actually, you won't ever document 100% of your business, right? You might document how to send an invoice. You might document how to send a credit note, or how to conduct a sales conversation, or how to have a performance review with an employee. But you won't document maybe going to the toilet. It's a thing that your team need to do, but you wouldn't document it. And so you say, well, so you won't ever get to 100% documentation. And so that's not even the aim. Instead, what do? Well, you apply the spotlight. You say, where's the focus? And the question to that is, where's the problem? So, for example, I've spoken at lots of events where people say, oh, but I've seen it where there are some processes that shouldn't be documented, or they've been documented badly or whatever. Like, for example, sales conversations, they shouldn't be documented. They end up too scripted. And so, well, that's true if sales is going great. Like if you've got a fantastic sales team, everyone's performing, they're achieving the level of conversion and happy customers at the end, then brilliant. Whereas if you've got a situation where actually one of your biggest problems in the business is that perhaps customers convert, but then later on they end up really dissatisfied because they feel they've bought something that they then didn't receive, and that there's a mismatch of what sales are selling versus what is being delivered, then what you might want to do is go, well, what was the training, the system, the process that we have for our salespeople? Because I like to assume that people are incompetent rather than malicious. So I assume that the salespeople are not actively lying. It's that it's likely that they didn't fully understand what was being sold. So what's the information that we're giving our salespeople on how to sell it? How are we suggesting that those salespeople present that to the customer so that we don't have this problem down the line? And so what you're able to do is go back from your root cause of your problem, which might be customer satisfaction problems, issues with your Google ratings, high amounts of client churn, and go back and say, well, what's causing this problem and how do we fix that? And if you don't have any processes documented with something that particularly with service type businesses where you can't see a physical production line, it's very difficult to do a post-mortem if the body is not on the table, right? So when you've got a process documented, it allows you to then go and look at it and say, well, where is it in this journey that we've got something wrong? Where is it that we're making clear to a salesperson that they need to make sure that they've asked this question, or that they've presented this information, or whatever? Now, that doesn't mean that you then document every single word that comes out the salesperson's mouth. And that's the mistake that a lot of people make, is that they then go to that nth level of detail. We say, okay, if I go back to that 4-stage model, 1 was focus. So if I continue with this example, we've got a focus problem of customer churn and unhappiness because of mismatch of delivery and sales. Then we say, okay, 2nd stage is outline. What guidance needs to exist to solve this problem? So it might be training for the salesperson is important. Maybe actually there's some collateral that the client should receive as part of the sales process. So it's actually written down. Maybe too much is just verbal and it's easy to get lost. So there's a few clear things that need to exist. And then stage 3, prioritize, document, and delegate. Prioritize, document, and test/delegate. So what we do is say, of those things, what's going to have the biggest impact? So maybe it's the training for the salesperson, or maybe it's the collateral. So we take that, we document that, then we test it, hand it over, and then step back and say, is the problem now solved? And if it is, you maybe don't need to document it anymore. You've already got an outline of your sales process end to end. You've got the problem solved. Great, move on to something else. Whereas if you then go, okay, it's solved 50%, but actually we've still got this other problem, then you repeat that cycle until finally you can move to stage 4, which is manage, which is basically where you get to a point where you manage on outcomes and only challenge, okay, do we need to improve the process when there's a problem again? And I think that's the key. The key is that, yes, you can solve many problems in your business using processes, but don't make the mistake of then thinking, okay, so I need to manage the process and the doing. Instead, manage the outcomes, but you can use process to look at what's the root cause, rather than go, oh, the problem is Jenny just keeps on forgetting to put the correct VAT rate or whatever, and instead say, well, actually, is it that we've not made it easy for Jenny to know which VAT rate she should apply, given that we work with so many different countries and so many different products or whatever?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, business is multifaceted, right? And I was taking notes, and going back to your earlier point about business model, it's funny. A point you just made then was about what's the actual problem. And the answer rarely is it just one thing. So you've got to kind of look at it in the round, right? So you were talking about business model, and you're talking about early businesses of yours versus your current one. And therefore, some people, I believe, erroneously comes to the conclusion, well, I've got the wrong business model. If only I had a software-driven, a software-based business, then I wouldn't have problems around delegation because I can have scale because it's based upon the code, right? Not a service-based business where I've got to hire more people. And that's not true. And an interesting story that long-time listeners of this podcast will know and look back in the feed and listen to this episode is, Alexis, you'll remember Ricky Singh. And Ricky is a good example of this, speaking to process, because Ricky realized that for his business to grow, Evergen, and by the way, he went from, if you haven't spoken with Ricky recently, he went from 12 to 30. Hold on, let me get this right. I've forgotten the number. He more than doubled revenue. I think he might have trebled revenue, but he went from 12 million to 30 million, let's say, or somewhere thereabouts in one financial year. And like a ridiculous rate of growth. But the inflection point was actually caused by the process, because he kind of went, so his thinking was, he was like, look, I've got it. I've now got the ability to scale the delivery. So the installations, I've got that big piece nailed. I can get scale exponentially. So now it's on the sales side. So initially it's like, well, get the lead volume. And then he could get the lead volume sorted, and then he realized the choke point was hiring the salespeople that would do the selling, because it was in-home selling. And he went, the challenge was, how do I get more salespeople? And he realized that actually the issue wasn't in hiring salespeople. It was, at first he thought, can I just hire better so they're more likely to succeed? And even though his background's in recruitment, he couldn't figure out a way to get the success rate much higher than 1 in 3. So he'd hire 3 people and 1 would pass probation, basically. And then in the end, he went, actually, it's not a problem. The math still works. I'm better off just hiring 3 people and knowing that only 1's going to work. And if more than one works, then that's fine. But it just didn't on average work out that way. And he went, actually, so now the question is not how do I hire 3 people, but how do I hire 30 people in a go? And then he developed a whole process and a system which he was then able to delegate to his team. So he hired full-time people inside the company. The job was to recruit and onboard the sales team. So it was like seminars and training, and it was an interesting process. And really, effectively, that was the catalyst that allowed this radical growth. And if you go back, if you listen to this, go back and search in the podcast feed. That of course kicked off other problems, but that's just the game of business, right? Because then if you grow that quickly, then you've got issues on supply and retention. And well, if you onboard more than 100 people in a year, you're going to have some internal cultural issues, that's for sure. So, but I suppose I just wanted to tell that story about Ricky and process. But I suppose, Alexis, coming back to the point, how do you differentiate? Because there's the business model is one element, but it's not the be all and end all. The process is one element, but then also the people's one element. And I think sometimes I've got another client who's got he's got high 6-figure profits, 7-figure business, and it feels like he makes the process more complicated. When my assertion, I said to him, is that I feel that he's got some weak members on the team that are just not good enough to do the job that he needs at the level it needs to be done at. How do you manage that overlay between, I suppose it's a reiteration of my previous question, which is, how do you differentiate between it's a people problem versus it's a process problem?
Yeah, and I really like that bubbling it down to how do you know when it's a people problem versus process problem? Because I think that as you say, the temptation is that you go with your strongest suit or your
Right.
preferred one. And often or it may mean that actually it's the other one that you need in that situation.
It's the one you don't want to handle.
Exactly. So the way that that I recommend that people look at it is often, because I think that it's often easier to solve the process problem than it is the people problem. My preference is that I start with assuming that it's a process problem. And then so for example, let's say that invoicing. I noticed that invoicing has consistently left out a key fee that we're meant to charge on rush projects. Like I think of a particular printing company that we work with where that was the case for them, and this particular business owner as a result didn't really want to let go of quoting and invoicing and so on because it
Right,
was
because it's
killing
costing him or
profitability.
her money. Right.
Correct. So let's say in that example that this particular business owner delegates it to, we'll call them Jenny, and Jenny is now responsible for this. Now, when this business owner first spots that Jenny has made a mistake, or maybe looks at the accounts after a month or sooner or whatever, and realizes, oh my God, we're in this trouble. That's the time to shine the spotlight. That's a clear pain point. And we say, okay, well, is it the person or is it the process? Because equally, I know business owners that have gone, oh, it's the person, fire them, bring someone else in, wait a few months, and then go, oh, they're rubbish too, fire them, bring someone in, wait a few months, they're rubbish too. And at what point they then go, actually, is it the person or is it me? And typically that's very common for like heads of finance roles and so on, where you go, actually, am I just making this role too difficult? And I think that's my point, is often have you made the role easy to be successful in? Because what we can do in the case of Jenny is we can say, well, actually, okay, Jenny, this mistake was made. Like, how are you currently doing this? Like, what's the process that you're going through currently? And if the answer is, oh, well, I just try and remember it, I'd argue saying, oh, well, Jenny, can you remember next time, please, makes that job quite hard. And it means if Jenny goes on holiday, is sick, leaves, I've now got to do the same thing with someone else. So instead, I'd say, well, no, this is clearly something that is difficult because it wasn't just obvious and fixed the first time round. We keep on getting these mistakes, perhaps even after it's been kind of mentioned or highlighted. So as a result, how do we make it easy for Jenny to not make this mistake? So I would say, okay, well, what's the checklist? What's the process that you're going through? And so perhaps she hasn't got one, so we can create one. And I can empower Jenny to create a simple checklist that means that she covers the most important things. Doesn't need to detail everything, but can highlight the most important things. Now, she then carries on, fantastic. And maybe everything goes well for a while. Let's say that Jenny then starts making that mistake. I'd then go back and say, okay, Jenny, this mistake's happening again. What's going on? What's the process you're following? And she might say, oh, I stopped using it. Right? In which case, it might be as simple as just going, let me help you understand the impact that this has when this goes wrong. Because perhaps Jenny didn't realize how important this was. So as a result, we communicate that, and she goes, yeah, absolutely, you're right. I thought that I knew this well enough, so I stopped using the checklist. But you're right, it's so important. I should use it every single time. I'm going to use it every single time. That might be it. You might never have to deal with that ever again, and you go solve other problems. But if Jenny makes that problem again and she's just not from the process, or she's sloppy with it or whatever, that's when you've then got a people problem. That's when you can then say, okay, we're still getting the mistakes. We've covered this numerous times, and hopefully you've captured in your notes of your one-to-ones with Jenny over the course of periods of having this issue, providing feedback, seeing improvements, having the issue, providing feedback, which means that hopefully or ideally as part of a documented performance management process, you'd be well within your rights to exit Jenny from the business, right?
Yes.
Because you've gone through a process to provide feedback, try and help us solve the problem and so on. Whereas if you started all of that with, Jenny, you've been making these mistakes, I don't like seeing mistakes, you're out the business, your risk of a tribunal is pretty high.
Right. It was making me think
Plus, not great for culture. Because other people in the organization may like Jenny. They may even feel that actually Jenny was pretty smart, but it wasn't made clear to her how to do things. And that's not a great feeling if you've just kicked her straight out of the business without giving her a chance for any support or development.
Yeah, it's funny, and I'm slightly conscious of the time. Alexis, I know that you and I, we might have to come back for round two, and people, I encourage you to comment if you want us to dive deeper. But a couple of kind of closing thoughts. there's somebody that we know that we've part of our community, been in a boardroom, and his nickname was affectionately known as the Axe. I think I'm talking about who built up a business that was very successful, 7-figure profits, which is a very, very hard feat. On a more than one occasion, he basically fired the whole company, much to our dismay, I think, because he was like, no, they're the problem, gone, go. And then lo and behold, a year or two later, when he had to do it again, and we would argue that the people weren't the problem. And so I suppose my summary, Alexis, and I'll hand it back to you, and I'd love to know how people can dive deeper, find out about Air Manual, but also if they just want to be in touch, how they could do that. But if I look at Alexis, the people in my world that I work with, that I've seen make significant money and keep it sustainably, so they've got a profitable, growing business. The ones who are certainly at 8-figure revenues sustainably and profitable, there's a common thread. The business model is normally surprisingly simple. And when they diversify, they get their ass handed to them and they come back to the core business model. Yep. Normally, their internal processes, because the business model is simple, they don't have to have ridiculous amounts of documentation, but they're really dialed in on what the process should be and what the measurements at each of the stages of, for example, the sales process should be, or the onboarding of new clients, etc. So they're really dialed in about that. And then if they've got a simple business model and clearly well-defined processes, ding, 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 and then you add to that key people, like really good people in the right seats, that's when you've got a business which is going to be, if you're at 8-figure revenues and profitable, you're already in, 1 in 1,000 kind of territory, 0.1% of a percent, or 0.1% territory. And it's kind of like, it's not one thing. It's that it's a multivariant system, and you've got to have the key bases covered. But chances are, if you listen to this, Alexis' last point probably holds true, which is whatever is the area you want to avoid, that might be the area that you need first. That's one that you should lead to. So those that are listening that have heard 1,000 times, they need to get dialed in on the processes, Alexis, but they don't know where to start. What should they do next? How can they find out about you, Air Manual? How can they get in touch?
Cool. Yeah, I love that. So, so if we want to learn a bit more about Air Manual, you can go to airmanual.co. Where you find a bit more about the product and the service. It's also got a link you can click on resources, and we've got loads of great sort of playbooks and example processes and templates that you can use. I wrote a playbook around like resolving unsatisfactory employee performance, for example, for those people that perhaps struggle or feel uncomfortable with how do I manage people? What do I do in a one-to-one? How should we do performance reviews, etc. We've got well-documented processes that mean that it makes it easy for managers in a business to actually manage poor performance rather than just hide away from it, because it's quite can be a scary thing to do. So there's that, but also I'd highly recommend people arrange a call with our team to even just get facilitated and supported on where you need to shine the spotlight, get some examples on how we've solved that with other clients, or get some templates. That might be enough for you, or you can then explore how we might work together. The other thing to check out is I've got my own podcast, which is De-Stress Your Business, which you can find at destressyourbusiness.com, or you can find it on Apple and Spotify and so on. But yeah, I think for many people, as you say, either they need to learn and tackle the how do I manage the people side, or they're finding it frustrating that actually they are managing people but they're still not getting consistent results, or it's difficult to scale improvement across the organization, and as a result they need to sort out the processes. But either of those, I've got loads of content on destressyourbusiness.com. People can reach out to me, alexis.kingsbury@airmanual.co, or they can check out airmanual.co and all the resources we've got there.
I love that, Alexis. So yeah, check out airmanual.co. Lots of people in our community have used Air Manual, and there's been some tremendous success stories. So check that out. Check out Alexis' podcast as well. And Mr. Kingsbury, it's as always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.